In the program Current Affairs, now we bring you a discussion on role of Lokpal and Lokayukta in eradicating corruption. The participants are Professor Subroto Mukherjee, former faculty, Delhi University, Shekhar Iyer, Deputy Editor, Hindustan Times, and Aditi Tandon, senior journalist, who initiates and moderates the discussion.
46 years after it was first initiated by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, the Lokpal Bill has been passed by the Parliament of India. The debate around Lokpal Bill actually gained ground about 2 years ago with Anna Hazare and a lot of his supporters, leading a full civil society movement against the prevalent graft in India's public sector. Although the public perception has forever been that India is a very corrupt nation, we have consistently performed very badly on the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. But finally, we have some kind of an independent mechanism whereby investigations as well as prosecution of public functionaries, including the officers of the Prime Minister's office as well as the Prime Minister with certain riders, will be subject to some kind of a probe. This particular law is actually supposed to give a lot of inspiration to the civil society to come forward and report corruption, because one big problem in the country is reporting of corruption. Professor Mukherjee, how much do you think a law will help in clearing public perception about India being a corrupt society?
If you really look to what you say, is true of bulk of the developing world. It's just not India. The other countries are also looked to the same way. One reason, of course, is the scarcity. If there is a scarcity situation, there is a normal tendency for the society to be more complacent, and also that we find the level of corruption reaches the bottom. So it is not the kind of corruption that we really find in the advanced countries of a huge payoffs, but corruption here is biting, because you see it happening everywhere, including when you get into the train. So the nature and perception is very different, and what happened in recent years, as you say, the civil society intervention, because the political parties did not take it up. So the party system in India is very weak, and that's the reason this initiative came. And I think it's a very welcome move, and I will put it as a moderate move, because the federal thing has been maintained in a very proper manner, the balance. And also, there is a level playing field, because if you really look to the vigilance and the Lokpal, in a way they complement each other. In that sense, I think it's quite a comprehensive effort to create an atmosphere in which not only we should be just, but we should also appear to be just. And I just put to in a context that the other important factor, that India is the first large democracy which is experimenting with it. It's not the United States, it's not Britain, but the initiative has come to a very large and a new democracy. In that way, I think it is very laudable that the leadership has taken up the challenge, and though there is miles to go, I think the initiative is welcome.
Mr. Iyer, it has taken years and decades to actually pass this bill. There's been so much debate and consultation around it, and consensus has still not been reached in the true sense of the word, because we all saw in the parliament, one of the biggest political parties, the Samajwadi Party, still boycott the proceedings. What do you think prevents the political class from coming together on issues that matter so greatly and hugely to the public at large? And also, how do you view the issue of credit seeking?
There is definitely a credit game. Like you have a blame game, there is a credit taking game. When such an important law is being legislated, naturally there are reasons why it is being done now. This is coming at the end of UPA's 10-year rule. And of this period, we have seen the government has been rocked by scams and cases of corruption involving even ministers. You had cabinet ministers, being put in jail, like in the case of 2G. So this whole outrage over the kind of things that has been going on. But finally, because of the pressure, sheer pressure of public opinion, that the political class itself is by and large corrupt, or at least colludes with the corrupt. And political parties are not responding to the kind of suffering the people are undergoing when they have to deal with the system. Whether it is from a driving license to getting your land record straightened or registration of your house. So every single dealing by a member of the public involving any government department, the tale has been one of you have to pay, get it done. Now given this kind of impression and kind of political scams and corruption, I think the pressure was so much. Any other party could not but take this head on. And that is largely because in the last 3 years, we have seen agitations led by Anna Hazare, and these very people who have finally, had to break away from him and form a political party. That is why I think in the credit game, even Sonia Gandhi, Sushma Swaraj also said that actual credit goes to the people, because people wanted this and political parties had to respond to it.
Professor Mukherjee, given the condition of transparency in our society currently, do you think the Lokpal Bill as a standalone will be fine in the absence of the Citizens' Charter, which was equally part of the sense of the House resolution which was passed in 2011 when this whole debate around Lokpal was initiated, after Anna Hazare and his team were drafted into the Joint Action Committee which was constituted by the government. For the first time, the government had actually involved civil society in the process of drafting of a law which was important in its own way, although it had its repercussions. What do you have to say on the Citizens' Charter?
Citizens' Charter is a broad category, came from Britain. It's the major government that initiated, and again it calls for transparency and also a much more rigorous scrutiny of the public services, and also the demand of the people, how it gets transmitted in policy formulation and execution. Try to understand the compulsions. We have also raised some very genuine points. That will it really affect decision making? Will it affect developmental process? And how does it work it out? So I think it is a positive side that following the Gandhian dictum of one step at a time, the legislation has restricted itself to broad categories and tried to make it functional. So Citizens' Charter would have been incorporated in it, then it could have been much more comprehensive, but then probably ineffective. And mind you that this is the beginning of the reform process. This is not the end of the reform process. For instance, every state will formulate its own Lokpal, that kind of a ombudsman. And out of that experience, I think a lot of changes we will see in the coming years. But the important point is that it is experimented in a specific manner. The decisions are to be time-bound, and I think even the selection process has been made quite rigorous. And again, the controversial part of the Prime Minister being excluded or included, really taken up a realistic view of keeping out of purview certain important actions of the Prime Minister, but other things comes under its purview. So again, if you really look to the public organizations which have public funding, they have also come in a particular category. So I think it's a good legislation, and out of that legislation something is expected. Now the larger issue, that does laws change society, and is legislation the only way? I think there the important thing, Kua, who is a Singapore-based professor and has done enormous work on corruption, he thinks that it helps. And it helps in creating an atmosphere where people really know their rights and also the limitation of the governmental functions. So again, I think the third point that will help is the technology. More and more computerization will clear the situation much more. So it is again a legislation which is timely and in a way was a necessity.
Mr. Iyer, a lot of controversy was generated around the fact that there is religion-based reservation in the formation of the selection committee. The leader of the opposition, Arun Jaitley, in Rajya Sabha raised this point. How do you look at the fact that minorities will have to be also part of the selection panel which has been listed under the Lokpal Bill? And also, how do you react to the bureaucrats' apprehension that their functioning is going to be affected?
As far as the religious-based reservation, you see, that is something which even this government has realized that there are constitutional blocks or hurdles in, giving purely reservation on religious lines. They have mentioned in this Lokpal Bill that 50% members of the Lokpal setup will consist of people belonging to scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, OBCs and minorities. In the process of selection, it can be done rather than, specifically allotting a particular percentage for a religious group. That they have taken care. The second aspect, as Mulayam Singh was appealing to Shradvani and to Sonia Gandhi, saying that don't do this. This will lead to a kind of fear of babus. But I think this kind of feeling that somebody will be persecuted because of the stronger law, I don't know, somehow I feel many of those fears are not very genuine. Because what should a bureaucrat be scared of? He should be scared of a decision which is not taken in with good intention. Therefore, those bureaucrats who always felt that they are forced by their political bosses to do something can actually feel, because everything is going to be noted. The whole decision-making process will be paper traceable. I think there is more strength for the bureaucrats to feel safer under the system rather than feel, they can be persecuted. And also in the manner in which, for the first time, you will have the prosecution wing will not be under the control of the executive. This is the way it is there in UK and US. The Crown Prosecution Service is an independent entity in UK. Similarly, you have the FBI has a lot of powers in US. So therefore, I think in itself this legislation is a very powerful law. And like every law, it is those who fear that they are in the wrong or they are capable of wrongdoing. Because if politicians were to say, because of this I am not able to take decisions, I don't think that will be correct. Of course, post 2G scam, when some IAS officers were sent to jail, this thing came up that a large part of the problem, the policy paralysis problem which this government faced, because bureaucrats were no longer willing to stick their neck out in any hard decision. But I think it was a decision in which they are not willing to stand up for. Then the nature of the decision is called into question. If you are not willing to stand up and own up for what a particular line of you have done, which means somewhere along you feel that often you have to work through circumstances and situation and pressure where probably you are not taking the best decision.
Professor Mukherjee, now that we have a law and we have a strong law, as Mr. Iyer pointed out, a truly independent prosecution wing, CBI director is also going to be selected in a very transparent manner, and the Prime Minister himself is under the purview of the law. How should the general public access this law? Because most often the problem arises at the level of the public awareness. How do you as a citizen feel about this law?
Well, you see, we have moved to an era of right-based legislations. We have a right to information, right to education. So, to say that the people do not know is not exactly correct. Because look to the circulation of the regional channels and also the regional papers. So, people know about it and people talk about it, and out of they also find out what the reality is. But I think Shekhar made some very good points, and one very important point is the decision-making process and the accountability. Now, it is quite possible that in any kind of a decision-making process, some decisions will stand the test of time, some may not. But that will not mean that they are related to corruption. So, as long as, we make a distinction between it, and there is a body to check the rampant corruption as we find today, I think the process will be smoother. And either way, if you really look to, one very important difference between the vigilance and the Lokpal is it covers the entire bureaucracy. It's just not the class 1 services, which are merely 150,000, but about the 7 million or, the number that is there, they are covered entirely. And it is this lower category of people with whom the people really come to contact every day. And there, again, I will emphasize, with the introduction of computers, I think it's quite feasible to see that the reform process is working, and with the experience that we'll have out of it, I think the future will be brighter than what it is today.
Yeah, Mr. Iyer, coming back to the same question of citizens' empowerment, because there is very recent data available, the Global Corruption Barometer, which was released only 2 months ago, conducted by a UK-based agency, which actually said that 34% of the world population that was surveyed to actually find out how many of them had paid bribes, 1 in 3 persons said that they never reported corruption. The issue of reporting is very important for the success of any legislation. And secondly, also the fact that a lot of corruption happens in educational institutions, in hospitals. These are all government-aided institutions which have finally been excluded from the purview of the law. The Select Committee of Rajya Sabha said that the government should only cover directly funded institutions and leave out the rest. Now, a lot of hospitals get free land, as we know, and then there are issues around whether patients are getting beds also or not, whether the poor are actually being treated. How do you look at this?
I consider passage of the Lokpal Bill as just the beginning. In fact, on the very day the bill was passed, senior leaders of different parties saying that this is just the beginning, because you will have to create a framework of laws, you will have to create a framework of watchdogs Because Lokpal is something you have kept at the pyramid. Now it has to come down. At least this law makes it mandatory for the states to set up Lokayukta. Apart from that, as Professor Mukherjee mentioned, you have the Citizens Charter, which will specify the kind of services which any government department has to provide within that specific time and for a specific cost. Similarly, you need to also amend the Prevention of Corruption Act, because following this Lokpal Bill, you'll have to make changes in that main Prevention of Corruption Act, where you'll have to define, in fact, the definition has to be more purposeful and more specific. Then also you'll have to look at, which the Prime Minister has often mentioned in his speeches, about the Public Procurement Bill, because the government is the biggest buyer of services and goods. So therefore, you need to have in place a law that regulates how the government purchases, whether it's an aircraft or it's a refrigerator. So you need to have a proper system of transparency in procurement, where you get it, how you get it, what are the methods, do you get the best price, do you get the best quality, because a lot of corruption is at the purchase level. Then you need to also bring in a bill to address, the foreign bribery, when the foreign companies, in order to secure contracts, they bribe bureaucrats. You need a specific law, like say in the US, there is a very specific law which bars US companies from getting business using corrupt means, and they have to report to US Congress. That's a law, and that law, when it came, there were a lot of skepticism because when companies are worried about their profits, they will always get a way to go around it. But that law has seen in America more and more compliance, because agencies have been very pursuing that American companies should not do business through these means. The question about the whistleblowers bill, because one of the objections that has come from Aam Aadmi Party leaders is that this doesn't, you haven't brought the whistleblowers bill. How do you protect the person who exposes corruption? So these are other framework which will have to be created. It cannot end and begin with Lokpal Bill. Lokpal Bill is more symbolic and more, I would say, a facilitating mechanism, but you will have to get down to each and every aspect of governance. And unless you plug all those, then you will not. But the fact that citizens have been now made aware that the system is changing, and people in the system are also aware, now this is changing. Now, like for instance, the manner in which, let us take the case of passport. I think one must concede, at least in bigger cities like Delhi, this application which has gone online and things have become more and more, unless you have some problems with your documents. I haven't heard of cases of late where people have had to pay huge money to get a passport. If you have your proper documents and the manner in which it has been done, you apply and then you get a date, you go. I have heard many people saying now that applying and getting a passport has become easier. Of course, some people have problems about going online because it requires you have access to computer. Those issues, because not many people have computer at home to do it. There are problems like that. More and more when you bring electronic kind of governance or electronic methods, things become more and more transparent.
When we talk of corruption, the whole corruption debate in India started because in the eyes of the people, political class, started to lose its credibility. The general feeling was that the most corrupt class is the political class, and actually statistics bear that out also. Professor Mukherjee, most non-corrupt societies, for example, if we take the case of Denmark, which has been consistently performing the best on the Transparency International's anti-corruption index. If you look at that society, the political class sets the bar for itself. For example, all the ministers have an unwritten code of ethics. They don't live in plush houses. They live very modest lives. The Speaker of the Parliament there goes to the Parliament on a bicycle. All ministers ride bicycles. So the perception that goes out in the public is that it's a modest style of life which the politicians are following. And corruption also starts from the way you want to live your life. The political class in India is into pomp and pageantry. It is something which even Mahatma Gandhi in his own times used to keep warning the Congress against. In a very famous letter that he wrote in 1937 to all Congress chief ministers, he actually used the words that pomp and pageantry are synonymous to vulgarity. So this whole issue of a code, an unwritten code of ethics for our own political class, for everyone, how do you reflect on that?
Well, a moral code of conduct, as you say, I see there is this comparison with the smaller affluent nations of Europe with a situation like ours is very difficult. You look to our constituencies, they are so large. You see, for instance, in Delhi, any MP wants to communicate with a single voter, then it will cost him $1 million to drop a postcard. Now here the situation is very different, and also some archaic laws. They are to be changed, as Shekhar is pointing out, that it is the beginning. We will need new legislations and also new awareness. But there is also another very important necessity there, is to have a culture where people will exercise their right and get it. You see, till now in India, for instance, the quota system that exists in most of the areas, that makes the politician powerful. And that's how he distributes his favors. About the lifestyle you really point out, that I think there is a generational change. Again, here, point that we should try to understand is that if we can really imbibe certain amount of discipline in the entire thing, and also the voters are aware about it, and this entire practice of a giver and a taker is done away with, then the quality of politics will improve. But again, here I like to point out that the politicians are in public attention all the time. Corruption in other areas is equally large. You look to the crony capitalism that we have. You remember Harshad Mehta, what he tried to attempt. And again, in every single area, there are vested interests. So if that is to be fought, then we will have to have a longer span and also a very different kind of legislation that I think will come out of this Lokpal legislation.
Mr. Iyer, the debate around the prosecution sanction, which was, hotly debated earlier, the government had to give the sanction for prosecution of bureaucrats, and now that power has been duly shifted to the Lokpal, and that was one of the select committee recommendations. How much of power emanates from this small change?
I would rather consider it's a very big change, because what has often happened is there are instances where the police investigation or investigation by, say, CBI in many matters have come up with conclusions warranting prosecution. But invariably, those such cases which involve sensitive people or people of high places, those matters have always taken a political color. In the sense, the decision would have to be approved by whoever is the highest political authority. And therefore, there was some kind of compulsion for the investigating agencies, to prepare accordingly their case, depending on who the political masters were. Now you have a very clear system. Once the matter is investigated by the CBI, after the investigation over, the entire findings is given to this new wing. This new wing will decide who should be prosecuted, how the matter has to be done. That is now some kind of insulation is there from political interference. One can take a cynical view and say that the corrupt will also get over this. They will also find in ways. But I think this is a very important departure, because now those who are in the prosecution wing will not feel in any way shackled because of the system. Rather, now a system has been created. They will go into the merits of the case and accordingly act.
And equally the fact that officers can't be transferred without...
And also that provision was also included, that proposals were made by leader of the opposition Arun Jaitley, who wanted that there will be the surprise element where they have to conduct a search or a raid. The accused will not be informed. Similarly, no officer who is serving the Lokpal or who is investigating a case ordered by Lokpal during the period of investigation cannot be summarily removed. Because we have had instances where some CBI officer who were not found to be convenient or comfortable for the political master is removed. So I think when you build in this kind of insulation, they help in a very big way. Because what may some seem as on the paper, a section changing or a new wing being created, when finally things get into action, when they are being implemented, definitely one will see that this is a very big change that has come, and ultimately it is not number of cases registered. The proof of the pudding is how many people have been prosecuted and how many people have been sent to jail. The more the people are prosecuted and sent to jail, that will act as a deterrent. Then the law becomes effective. That will encourage people to come with complaints, that will encourage the investigating agencies to proceed, and also it will be a warning to everyone else that if you violate the law will get after you.
Professor Mukherjee, this issue of none of the members of the Lokpal to be affiliated to any political party, that is again a very positive move in this new legislation. Earlier the term used was associated, and it was again debated in the select committee, and finally it has been said no affiliation to any political party also should be there of a member. How much of public confidence will be generated through such a move also?
I think it's a good move, and if you really look to the genesis of the political parties, it's an extra constitutional growth. And in that context, it will be very hard to really look into the affiliation nature of it, and also the power that a particular individual may wield in the party and outside. Democracy is all about institutions, and the problem with Indian democracy is that the institutions are quite weak. But over a period of time, you see that if you really look to 40 years. You see Keshwana and Bharati, the basic structure of the constitution, and this Lokpal Bill, I'll compare it to that historic event, that these have given a direction and also certain kind of identity to every single operator within the system, that how do you operate. And this Lokpal thing has made another thing very clear, that even if you have a godfather, he may not be able to help you to get out of the muddle.
And Mr. Iyer, this issue of the PMO also being brought under the purview, how do you look at it politically?
I think this demand was constantly there, that even the highest political office should be within its purview. So with necessary safeguards that you should not have flippant complaints just to cause a political instability. And our Prime Minister and even other previous Prime Ministers were of the view that it should not be done in a manner where, people feel that some offices is being excluded. Of course, there are certain decisions which are either relating to defense or to external affairs, or certain matters where the Prime Minister will not be under scrutiny for that. But any other issue where if an allegation were to be made and if the Lokpal deemed it fit, then the Prime Minister would be subjected to a kind of probe. This is a political message. If the Prime Minister has not been spared, that means the message goes down the line that no matter who you are, no matter which position you occupy, you are under scrutiny and you are under watch.
Quickly, Professor Mukherjee, one root of corruption is funding of elections, the way elections are funded in India. And there's been a demand about state funding to clean up the political system. Are you for it?
No, I'm not for state funding. You see, the Election Commission has taken certain steps which have reduced the cost of election to a considerable degree. I think the Election Commission should also stipulate much more rigorous checks on it. That is much better than state funding, because state funding really does not work the way it has worked in some countries, and that's why I think political parties are an extra constitutional development. They should be left to fend for themselves rather than spending public money.
What is your take on state funding?
I will agree with Professor Mukherjee, because state funding of elections, though has seem to work in other countries which are more affluent and more developed. But in a situation like India, where elections are keenly contested and use of money power is so prevalent in such a large way, because it is not going to prevent use of other funds. State will contribute, let us say, a particular amount for every candidate, but that does not prevent the candidate from seeking other non-state funding. So why should taxpayers' money, add to the money power? Though there are ways and means where one should ensure a level playing field, because already Election Commission is concerned, and a lot of political analysts feel that today the election is very expensive. In fact, the permissible limits which are sanctioned by the Election Commission and actual expenditure incurred by candidates, there is a huge gap. But I think the answer would be greater vigilance by the Election Commission would go a longer way, rather than, you already, when a government is facing resource crunch, to open up the treasury for such kind of expenditure, though how noble the objective may be, will not serve any purpose.
Then on this note, as Mr. Jaitley had pointed out, no law is an ideal law. We will learn and evolve. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on role of Lokpal and Lokayukta in eradicating corruption. The participants were Professor Subroto Mukherjee, former faculty, Delhi University, Shekhar Iyer, Deputy Editor, Hindustan Times, and Aditi Tandon, Senior Journalist, who initiated and moderated the discussion. It came to you in the program Current Affairs, produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. This program is also available on our website, newsoneir.nic.in. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.